The air in the quiet suburban neighborhood carried a deceptive sense of peace, the kind that masked the unspoken tensions simmering beneath the surface. For the narrator, a military veteran still grappling with the ghosts of his past, this place was meant to be a sanctuary, a fresh start where he could heal in relative solitude. His house, a modest but comfortable one-story home, sat at the end of a cul-de-sac lined with neatly trimmed hedges and driveways occupied by SUVs and sedans. It was the kind of neighborhood where children rode bikes in the summer, retirees tended to their rose gardens, and everyone pretended not to pry into each other's business, at least, most of them. The narrator wasn't completely alone in his journey. He had Max, his loyal German shepherd and certified service dog, by his side. Max was more than just a pet. He was a lifeline, trained to sense his handler's anxiety spikes, provide grounding pressure, and wake him from night terrors when the memories of war clawed their way into his dreams. Their bond was unbreakable, forged in the fire of shared hardship, and for the first few weeks in the new neighborhood, things seemed manageable. The peace, however, was short-lived. Karen Winters made her presence known the way a storm does, suddenly and without regard for anyone caught in its path. As president of the Homeowners Association, she reigned over the neighborhood with an iron grip disguised as civic duty. The other residents tolerated her because they had little choice. Anyone who dared challenge her authority found themselves buried in a mountain of code violations, anonymous complaints, and passive-aggressive letters about lawn heights and mailbox placements. She had a reputation for being relentless, and it wasn't long before the narrator found himself in her crosshairs. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a sharply worded notice slipped under his door, citing an unauthorized structure in his backyard, a small shed he used for storage. Then came the warning about his trash bins being left out too long, despite the fact that they were placed at the curb no earlier or later than anyone else's. The narrator, having spent years navigating bureaucratic red tape, knew exactly what this was, a power play. Karen had pegged him as an easy target, a new resident with no allies in the community, someone she could strong-arm into submission. But what Karen failed to realize was that the narrator wasn't the type to be bullied. Their first face-to-face confrontation happened one crisp autumn afternoon, when the narrator was enjoying a rare moment of calm in his front yard, Max resting at his feet. The German shepherd lay stretched out on the grass, his ears perked at the sounds of distant birds, his body language relaxed but ever watchful. Karen, dressed in her usual ensemble of a pressed blazer and an air of self-importance, marched up the driveway with a clipboard in hand. "Excuse me," she said, in a tone that suggested it was anything but a request. "Dogs must be leashed at all times in the front yard. HOA regulations are very clear on this." The narrator barely glanced up from his book. "Max is a service animal," he replied evenly. "Federal law protects his right to be here, leash or no leash." Karen's lips pursed, her grip on the clipboard tightening. "That may be, but this is a private community with rules that everyone must follow. I suggest you familiarize yourself with them." The narrator finally met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I'm very familiar with the law, Ms. Winters. The Americans with Disabilities Act takes precedence over HOA bylaws. You might want to familiarize yourself with that." For a brief moment, Karen hesitated, the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes betraying the fact that she hadn't expected pushback. But she recovered quickly, sniffing indignantly before snapping a photo of Max with her phone. "We'll see about that," she muttered, before striding away. It didn't take long for Karen to escalate her campaign against Max, each action more desperate than the last. First, she began documenting every time she saw the dog outside, lurking in the distance like a predator waiting for a misstep. Then came the threats, official-looking notices claiming the narrator would be fined for repeated violations of the community pet policy, despite the law being entirely on his side. The narrator, ever composed, responded by mailing her copies of the ADA's guidelines, complete with highlighted sections that explicitly invalidated her claims. But Karen wasn't interested in facts, she was interested in control. When intimidation didn't work, she resorted to fear. One afternoon, as the narrator and Max sat on the porch, enjoying the crisp breeze, Karen hovered at the edge of his property, phone raised like a weapon. "This is a warning," she called out, her voice edged with frustration. "If that dog so much as looks at me the wrong way, I'll report it as a dangerous animal." Max, sensing the tension, sat up straight, ears forward but still calm. The narrator exhaled slowly, his patience thinning. "That's a false report, and you know it," he said. "And if you follow through, I'll make sure you're held accountable for harassment." Karen scoffed but didn't respond, retreating with the air of someone who had just been told no for the first time in their life. The breaking point came on a day that should have been like any other, until it wasn't. The narrator had been working in his garage, the faint scent of sawdust in the air, when he heard a commotion outside. Max, ever the sentinel, had been resting on the front lawn when Karen approached yet again, this time armed with more than just her clipboard. The narrator stepped outside just in time to see her take a step backward, nearly losing her balance as she stumbled into her flower bed. Panic flashed across her face, and before anyone could react, she pulled a small canister from her pocket and sprayed a stream of liquid directly into Max's face. The effect was immediate. Max yelped in pain, recoiling as he desperately tried to rub the burning substance from his eyes with his paws. The narrator's breath caught in his throat, a wave of rage and helplessness surging through him. Karen, realizing what she had done, took a shaky step back, her expression a mixture of triumph and faux innocence. He lunged at me," she stammered. But the narrator didn't hear her. He was already kneeling beside Max, his hands shaking as he checked the dog's face, his heart pounding with a familiar, unwelcome adrenaline rush. The world around him blurred, but one thing was crystal clear. Karen Winters had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The pain in Max's eyes was unbearable to witness, and the narrator wasted no time. His hands trembled as he scooped up his loyal companion, Max's whimpers cutting through him like a blade. The burning chemical had already begun to inflame the sensitive skin around the dog's eyes, and his paws, frantic in their attempt to rub away the pain, only worsened the irritation. "Hang in there, buddy," the narrator murmured, his voice tight with barely contained rage. He shot a glare at Karen, who stood frozen on the edge of his lawn, her phone clutched in her hand like a shield. There was no mistaking the satisfaction flickering across her face, the cruel glint of someone who thought they had finally won. But she had underestimated her opponent. Ignoring her entirely, the narrator carried Max to his truck, placing him gently on the passenger seat before speeding off to the nearest emergency vet. His grip on the steering wheel was white-knuckled, his mind a storm of fury and disbelief. How could someone be so callous, so consumed by control that they would willingly harm an innocent animal? The thought of Max suffering because of this woman's pettiness made his blood boil. He would make sure she paid for this, legally, publicly, and in a way she would never forget. The vet clinic was a blur of antiseptic smells, fluorescent lights, and clipped voices moving with urgency. The moment he burst through the doors, a vet tech rushed to assist, ushering Max into the back while reassuring the narrator that they would do everything they could. But standing there, alone in the waiting room, he could feel the edges of his PTSD creeping in. His breath came too fast, his heartbeat hammered against his ribs, and for a moment, it was as if the walls were closing in. He clenched his fists, grounding himself in the present. He wasn't back in a war zone. There were no incoming threats, no explosions waiting to detonate. There was only Max, his best friend, his protector, now the one in need of protection. As he forced himself to take a slow breath, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, barely glancing at the screen before answering. "This is Name," he said, his voice tight. "Son, I just heard what happened," came the voice on the other end, calm but firm. It was the governor. The narrator had worked as legal counsel for the state government long enough to recognize that tone, the one reserved for situations that required immediate damage control. "You have my full support. We'll be looking into this." A wave of reassurance washed over him, but it was laced with something else, vindication. Karen Winters had no idea just how deep the hole she had dug for herself truly was. By the time the narrator and Max returned home, the neighborhood was already buzzing with speculation. Word had spread fast, probably faster than Karen anticipated. As he parked in his driveway, he noticed something unusual. Neighbors, ones who had previously kept their heads down and mouths shut to avoid Karen's wrath, were gathered in small clusters, whispering and exchanging glances. A few of them, those who had seen the incident unfold, looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and something else, solidarity. It was clear now that Karen's grip on the community was slipping, her decades-long reign of terror finally being questioned. But before he could even step out of his truck, flashing blue and red lights appeared in the rearview mirror. The police. And judging by the self-satisfied smirk on Karen's face as she stood at the edge of her driveway, arms crossed in smug victory, she had called them herself. The narrator exhaled, already anticipating her play. She was going to lie. She was going to twist the story, claimed that Max had attacked her, that she had only defended herself. But what Karen hadn't accounted for was evidence. Cold, hard, undeniable evidence that would turn her entire scheme against her. The responding officers, two middle-aged men with the weary expressions of those used to dealing with neighborhood disputes, stepped out of their cruiser. Karen wasted no time, launching into a rehearsed tirade about how the narrator's dangerous dog had lunged at her, forcing her to defend herself. "I was terrified for my life," she exclaimed, her voice thick with faux distress. "That animal should be removed from the community before someone else gets hurt." The officers listened, nodding politely, but when they turned to the narrator, their expressions shifted. "Sir, do you have a statement?" one of them asked. The narrator didn't respond immediately. Instead, he pulled out his phone, tapped a few buttons, and held it up. The screen lit up with the security footage from his porch camera, clear, unedited, and damning. In the video, Karen was the aggressor, Max was completely calm, and the attack had been unprovoked. As the officers watched, their faces hardened. The false report Karen had so confidently delivered was crumbling before her eyes. "Ma'am," one of them said, his tone now clipped and professional, "you said the dog lunged at you?" Karen paled. "Yes." "You saw? That's not what this video shows," he interrupted. A long, heavy silence followed, thick with the weight of inevitability. Then came the words Karen never expected to hear. "We're going to have to place you under arrest." As the cuffs clicked around Karen's wrists, the neighborhood came alive with murmurs and hushed gasps. For years, she had wielded the HOA's power like a weapon, terrorizing residents with fines, threats, and manufactured violations. But now, standing in her perfectly manicured yard with her hands bound behind her back, she was nothing more than a petty tyrant who had finally overstepped. "You can't do this," she shrieked, twisting in their grip. "I have friends in high places. This is harassment." The officers ignored her protests, calmly reading her rights as they led her toward the squad car. The narrator stood watching, arms crossed, as his neighbors slowly began stepping forward, people who had once been too afraid to speak up. "She fined me $300 for having a garden gnome," an elderly woman muttered. "Tried to get my son's truck towed for parking in my own driveway," another man added. The dam had broken. Karen's empire was collapsing, and as she was placed in the back of the police car, the narrator finally allowed himself a deep, steady breath. Justice was just beginning. Karen's arrest sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, but the fallout was far from over. As the police cruiser pulled away, carrying her toward a fate she never imagined for herself, the gathered residents didn't immediately disperse. Instead, they lingered, exchanging stories, whispered grievances that had been bottled up for years, now spilling out in a flood of long-overdue frustration. The narrator listened, standing beside Max, who was still shaken but recovering. He heard about unfair fines, retaliatory citations, threats of foreclosure over minor infractions. A single mother spoke up about how Karen had tried to have her son's bike confiscated because it had been left on the sidewalk for too long. Another neighbor, an elderly man, recounted how she had once demanded he repaint his house 3 times in 1 year because the shade of beige wasn't up to HOA standards. It became clear that Karen's downfall was more than just personal vindication. It was a reckoning for an entire community that had been held hostage by her tyranny. The narrator felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. He had never intended to be a hero, but now, whether he liked it or not, he had become the catalyst for change. The following day, the HOA board called for an emergency meeting, and for the first time in years, the community showed up in force. The clubhouse, usually half empty during these meetings, was now packed wall-to-wall with residents eager to see justice carried out. At the front of the room, the remaining HOA board members sat behind a long table, their expressions a mix of discomfort and urgency. Vice President Judge Harrington, a retired federal judge who had always played the role of Karen's enabler, now found himself in a precarious position. He cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he scanned the crowd. "Given recent events," he began, choosing his words carefully, "we have a serious matter to address regarding the leadership of this association." He didn't have to elaborate. Everyone knew exactly what this was about. The murmurs grew louder, voices rising with long-suppressed anger. "She's a criminal," someone shouted from the back. "She needs to be removed permanently," another added. The judge hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Effective immediately, Karen Winters is removed from her position as HOA president," he declared, his voice carrying the finality of a gavel strike. The room erupted into applause. Years of unchecked power, of bullying and intimidation, had finally come to an end. But Karen's downfall wasn't just a neighborhood victory. It had caught the attention of people far beyond the cul-de-sac. The narrator had suspected that the governor would follow through on his earlier promise of support, but he hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. The very next morning, he received a call from the state office, inviting him to a press conference. He had never been one for the spotlight, but this wasn't about him. It was about Max, and about ensuring that what had happened to him never happened to another service animal again. Standing behind the podium, microphones and cameras pointed in his direction, he recounted the events with careful precision. He spoke not just of Karen's cruelty, but of the broader issue, the mistreatment of service animals, the ignorance of laws meant to protect them, and the need for stronger enforcement. "Service dogs aren't pets," he said, his voice steady. "They are lifelines. And anyone who thinks they can harm one without consequence is gravely mistaken." The governor took the stage afterward, announcing new legislative measures to impose harsher penalties for those who assaulted service animals. It was a small step, but a significant one. And as the press conference wrapped up, the narrator felt something he hadn't in a long time, a sense of purpose beyond just survival. Meanwhile, Karen was facing a reality she had never prepared for: consequences. With her arrest making headlines and her removal from the HOA official, she found herself rapidly losing whatever remaining influence she thought she had. Neighbors who had once feared her now openly celebrated her downfall. Local news stations aired segments about the incident, replaying the security footage that had sealed her fate. Online forums buzzed with discussions about power-hungry HOA presidents and the need for oversight. Even the state legal system wasn't done with her. Charges for assaulting a service animal carried severe penalties, including hefty fines and possible jail time. Karen's attorney, a man who looked like he deeply regretted taking her case, argued that she had acted in self-defense, but the evidence was undeniable. And then there was the civil suit. The narrator had wasted no time in filing one, seeking damages for Max's veterinary bills and emotional distress. The case was a slam dunk, and when the verdict finally came down, Karen was ordered to pay thousands in restitution. The woman who had once ruled the neighborhood with an iron fist now found herself stripped of power, broke, and shunned by the very people she had once controlled. With Karen gone and the HOA undergoing a complete overhaul, the neighborhood began to change in ways no one had expected. The fear that had once lingered in the air was replaced by something lighter: relief, even hope. Residents who had been too afraid to speak up started taking back their community. The absurdly strict bylaws were re-evaluated, unnecessary fines were abolished, and a new, fairer system was put in place. But for the narrator, the biggest victory wasn't the changes in the neighborhood. It was the quiet moments with Max, knowing that justice had been served. Sitting on his porch one evening, watching as kids rode their bikes freely without fear of citations, he scratched behind Max's ears and exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "We did it, buddy," he murmured. Max let out a soft chuff, resting his head against the narrator's knee, content in the knowledge that his person was safe, and so was he.